So today, as you saw, we are going to be talking about some forest horror movies, therefore, I wore my bear shirt. Hey, what's up you guys? My name is Kylie. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm so glad to have you in my little corner of the internet. For my subscribers though who are returning, hey, what's up you guys? Love ya. But I know that today seems like kind of a random video. It really did just come out of nowhere, but I've found myself very much in the mood for outdoorsy horror lately. I think it's really just summertime. I mean, this is the time when I like to watch movies that take place out in the woods, in cabin in the woods, at the beach, at lakes, etc. But for this list, we're getting a little bit more specific, and we're talking about movies that take place specifically in forests. I'm also going to give a couple of honorable mentions that they don't really fit on this list, but I feel like there are people that would have been enraged if I didn't at least mention them. But that would include like Cabin in the Woods, all the Friday the 13th movies, Evil Dead, but to me those are obviously more like Cabin in the Woods type movies, more like camping movies, and so that will probably be a whole other list on its own of camping movies or Cabin in the Woods type movies. And I really wanted to cultivate a list that very specifically took place just in the woods. I will admit that some of these do involve cabins or houses, etc., but majority of the movie or the best parts of the movie take place in a forest. So those were just a couple of honorable mentions. I have a couple more to mention before we get into my top 10. So we have Jurassic Park, which I threw on there just because I'm not really sure if it counts as a forest horror movie. I just threw it in there because it is one of my favorite outdoorsy horror movies. They spend a good deal of the time out in the jungle, so it kind of counts just a little bit. But you know, that's more of an adventure horror, a creature feature, etc. And then my next honorable mention is again probably one of the ones that belongs more in a cabin in the woods type of a list, but anyways, it's It Comes at Night. Secure within a desolate home as an unnatural threat terrorizes the world, a man has established a tenuous domestic order with his wife and son. Then a desperate young family arrives seeking refuge. This is an A24 movie, so that being said, automatically I know it's not really going to be for everybody. It is a very well-made film. It is very relevant to kind of what's happened in the past year. If you're someone that has a fear of getting sick, if you have a fear of death, I think this movie really psychologically preys on a lot of those things. It's very, very heavy, so if you're not in the best headspace and you want to watch a movie for escapism purposes, that one's not going to be the one. It does have a great location, a great setting, and a lot of it does take place in the woods though. My last honorable mention, I just felt that I had to mention this one because it's literally just all about a forest, and that would be The Forest. This was more of a mainstream horror movie, but if you don't know what it's about, it's basically just about this woman who travels to this forest in Japan and she's searching for her missing sister. I don't think it's a really good movie. It's really not great. I do, however, really love the location. I also love that lead actress, but this is not one of her strongest performances. Also, the story in general and a lot of the scares they try to make end up just being kind of goofy. It's a weird movie. Some parts of it are effective for me and some parts of the story I do resonate with, and I found the direction they were going interesting, but they just didn't really quite pull it off. I just felt that I had to mention that as an honorable mention because it's probably the most forest-oriented movie on this list besides a couple others that we'll get to, but also it's literally called The Forest, so you know, there's that. Time to move on to my top 10. So at number 10, that would have to go to the alien sci-fi flick Annihilation. This one came out recently, but I do feel like it kind of flew under a lot of people's radars, so if you haven't heard of it, here's the synopsis. A biologist signs up for a dangerous secret expedition into a mysterious zone where the laws of nature don't apply. So this movie makes number 10 because it does have a lot of issues, but I think visually and the location and everything of this movie is beyond gorgeous. This is also one of my favorite alien movies, one of my favorite creature features, because the look of all of the animals in this sort of bubble of unexplained natural phenomenon or whatever, they look so bizarre, but they're so beautiful. So I guess I do like this movie less for the forest and more for the creatures and the visuals and stuff, but it does, I believe, for the most part take place in the forest, and so it was kind of perfect for this list. I did my top 10 creature feature list a long while ago, probably almost a year ago at this point, and so that definitely needs to be updated, and then when I do my top 10 alien movies list, this will probably fall onto both of those. I think the movie has a lot going for it. I will say though that the story is not super strong, and I do know that the ending of the movie is gonna lose a lot of people, not just story-wise, is, but visually they try to do some real artsy fartsy stuff. I personally love it, but I know it's not going to be for everybody. So be forewarned. I don't think that this will be most of your favorites on this list, and it's also at number 10 on mine, so you know, that should tell you something. But go into it maybe just for the visuals. Maybe manage your expectations for the story a bit. Don't expect the best story, and just go into it to kind of admire all of the work that went into all the visuals. All right, moving on to my number 9, and again, this one is not the most forest oriented, but the forest plays a huge role in this movie, and that would be The Witch. This is a Robert Eggers film, so right off the bat, it's of course not going to be for everybody, and if you haven't heard of it, here's the synopsis. A family in 1630s New England is torn apart by the forces of witchcraft, black magic, and possession. The style of the movie is extremely distinct, probably as you saw. They shot with completely natural lighting, which I think for the time period that it took place in, that completely made sense, because obviously back then they did not have electricity, and so the natural lighting really lends itself to kind of your immersion in this time jump. I also don't know if they did any color correcting for the movie. I mean, they probably did, but the colors are so incredibly muted. I think it's because of the lack of unnatural lighting, but they could have colored it, I'm not sure. But also like the wardrobe and everything like that is all very bland, all a lot of grays. Again, just makes the experience in the movie that much more immersive because of this really monotonous color palette. Ultimately, as a woman, the movie can be kind of hard to watch at times, just knowing how much of a struggle it was for us to live back then. But ultimately, by the end of the movie, I do feel very empowered as a woman. I think that the way that the witchcraft and the forest and everything ties into the ending of this movie is phenomenal. I mean, wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Yes. So this is one that maybe belongs on my top 10 period piece horror movies list or something, but the way that the forest plays into it, I just love. I love the setting. So for this one, maybe don't go into it expecting a really good summertime, outdoorsy kind of horror movie. Go into it more for the fact that it's a period piece and it's more of a think piece. Just want to forewarn you so that you don't go into it with, you know, different expectations. Up next at number 8 would be The Ritual, which I believe you can still find on Netflix. A group of old college friends reunite for a trip to a forest in Sweden, but encounter a menacing presence there stalking them. So this movie, the first 2 acts of this movie, I think are so brilliant and so worth revisiting, and just one of my favorite forest movies of all time. The third act, we get into some real weird territory. I'm just warning you right now so you can manage your expectations on that. The story is super interesting, and if you're into myths and lore, you will love this movie and you will love where it goes. I personally was just a little off-put and not in a good way by the end of this movie. Things got very weird. I think the first 2 movies are much more of a traditional horror movie, but I think that the way that they try to scare you is highly unique. I am very desensitized to a lot of horror movies. It takes a lot for a movie to scare me, and The Ritual did this successfully. I felt scared by this movie. Also, not only are the horror elements super effective, but I think that the story is really strong as well, specifically between this group of friends. You learn about their backstory in a very non-linear way, which when that's done well, I think it's such an effective story tool. I think non-linear stories can be really cool. A lot of times in movies, it's done to the movie's detriment. It's really hard to pull off, but I think this movie did it successfully. The third act is just where it starts to lose me. I know it won't lose everybody, but things just get very weird. So, you know, be ready for that. Now moving on to my number 7. This one might be more of a personal choice for me because I know it's not necessarily one of the strongest movies on this list, but that would be Blair Witch, which is one of the sequels to the original Blair Witch Project. I'm not going to read the synopsis for this one just because you probably know what's up. You know, a bunch of young adults go into the forest, bad things happen, you know, there's a witch, etc. But I think that if you're a fan of the original Blair Witch Project, or if you're a fan of found footage, I think you'll really like this movie. I rewatched this movie, I think back in March, so I talked about it in my Everything That I Watched in March video, but I do think that this movie gets a lot right when we're talking about the original Blair Witch Project. A lot of it is very understated. I think that the acting is pretty good, save for maybe a couple of characters that could have pulled their weight a little bit more. But what I liked about the original is just the fact that it was so understated, and Blair Witch doesn't go this route, which actually might be better for a lot of people. For people that prefer the horror to be a little bit more in your face, then I think Blair Witch would obviously be for you. And of course, let me know. I'd be interested to see if anybody that did not like the original Blair Witch Project ended up liking Blair Witch, because I do see that happening for some people. I personally don't like it as much as the original, but I think that it is a worthy sequel. Alright, moving on to my number 6, and all of these movies in my top 6 I think are so incredibly strong. I guess they could be interchangeable depending on the mood that I'm in. All of these in my top top 6 are actually close to being 10 out of 10 movies for me. Some of them are. So that being said, I'm going to move on to my number 6, which would be Gretel and Hansel, that came out in 2020. A long time ago in a distant fairy tale countryside, a young girl leads her little brother into a dark wood in desperate search of food and work, only to stumble upon a nexus of terrifying evil. I think I've talked about this movie plenty of times already on my channel. You guys know that I love it. Now, this is one where the story isn't necessarily super strong, and you might find the pacing to be just a little bit grating because of that. To me, however, this is one of the most relaxing horror movies I have ever seen, purely because of how good the visuals are all throughout. Now, one could argue this is more of a cabin in the woods type of a story because of where they end up, obviously, but a good deal of it, and I would say that majority of the first act at least does take place in the forest. There's a lot of trippy stuff that goes on outside, and there are more parts of the movie that are not just contained to the witch's house. Also, yet again, this is one where the ending might lose some people because you expected something a little bit more climactic, but again, like I said, this is just one of the most relaxing horror movies I've ever seen. Most of the focus of this movie is on the visuals and making it a very, visually pleasing thing to look at. It's so you're less so focused on the story and the characters, which I don't mind every once in a while. This might be too much of a stretch for a comparison, but another movie that focuses much more heavily on the visuals than the story is Godzilla vs. Kong. I think that's a great movie to see in the theater. I don't think it's a great movie in general, but it was epic. So it's kind of a similar situation to Gretel and Hansel. Gretel and Hansel is just obviously much more understated because it's not an action movie. I was just trying my best to make a comparison of like another movie that you really only watch for the visuals, And it's also just this wonderfully unique twist on a very old and overdone story of Hansel and Gretel. I think it's lovely. If it's one that you've kind of been putting off watching for a bit, then maybe give it a try. But if you're someone that's not so much into the visuals of the movie, but you're more into the story or the action, then this probably won't be the one for you, but I think that everyone should just give it a chance. But I'm gonna move on now to my number 5, and this is one that I think all horror fans will find something to enjoy about, and that would be Never Hike Alone. This is a fan-made Friday the 13th film, and you can find it free to watch on YouTube. A hiker's survival skills are put to the test when he stumbles upon the remains of an old abandoned camp and discovers its long, dark secrets. This is a movie that I reviewed a long time ago when I was doing my Friday the 13th series, but the writer and director, Vinny DeSanti, he is super awesome. He's currently working on the 3rd movie of their fan-made Friday the 13th installments here on YouTube. It's called Jason Rising, and the release date is August 13th, just so you know. But anyways, this movie, this first Friday the 13th fan film, has such a magical place in my heart. It's only 54 minutes long, so it's technically a short film, and so I promise you it will not waste your time. It's free to watch on YouTube. Just please check it out. This, of course, takes place all in the woods, so if you're looking for a forest movie, this one, I promise you, is the one. I think that it 100% captures the energy of Friday the 13th while putting a more modern twist on it. He really sucked out all of the formulaic methods they would use for slashers back then and made such a fresh and unique story. I love it, and I know that this is controversial, but it is my favorite Friday the 13th movie, even if it is just a fan-made film, so I really can't recommend it enough. I hope that you do check it out. Moving on to my number 4, which is one of my favorite found footage movies, one of my favorite dark comedy movies, and that is Troll Hunter. This is one that took me way too long to watch. It is such an underrated and hidden gem. A group of students investigates a series of mysterious bear killings, but learns that there are much more dangerous things going on. They start to follow a mysterious hunter, learning that he is actually a troll hunter. So as I said, this is a dark comedy. I mean, how serious can you really be when you are dealing with trolls? Some parts of the movie are genuinely scary, though. They still manage to weave in a good amount of genuine suspense, but there is a lot of comedy in there as well. It really kind of tiptoes along this line of being self-aware while also kind of trying to take the subject matter seriously. It's pretty much just a satire, it's kind of hard to explain. I think the reason why it's such a hidden gem and not enough people talk about it is because it is a Norwegian film. I'm assuming that's why I never heard of it, and not a lot of people really recommend international films, but if you're not super big on international films or international horror or whatever, this is one that I promise you is so worth watching. Please, please give it a chance. Not only is the story really strong, the comedy really strong, a lot of the horror elements really strong, but so much of the cinematography, even though it's just a found footage film, is so breathtaking. I think it's because we're following these students that are documentarians, they are filmmakers, and so that's why so much of it ends up being so gorgeous. You do get to see a lot of the Norwegian countryside. It's so beautiful. It's so worth seeing. Just as a whole, so many aspects of this movie are good, and that's what makes it so worth watching in my opinion. It's not just for the setting, it's not just for the story, it's not just for the style, but just as a whole, it is such a good underrated movie, and so I hope that some of you guys do watch it. Actually, so Troll Hunter and the next two movies on this list I think are all criminally underrated, so that being said, I'm going to move on to my top 3 forest horror movies of all time. Coming in at number 3, which would be Hunter x Hunter, that came out in, I believe, November of last year. Joseph and his family live in the remote wilderness as fur trappers, but their tranquility is threatened when they think they are being hunted by the return of a rogue wolf, and Joseph leaves them behind to track it. So as you saw by that little bit of footage, you could probably tell that Devon Sawa stars in this movie, and if you know him from nothing else, he was in the first Final Destination movie. I'm a big fan of him. His performance in this movie is phenomenal. All the acting performances of this movie are actually just insanely underrated. I think the name of the woman that plays his wife in this movie is Camille Sullivan, and her performance is... I cannot praise it highly enough, because the twists that you take with her character, oh baby. In my opinion, I think that the whole movie leading up to the ending is still incredibly strong, but the ending of this movie and the twists of this movie, I can't really explain how not ready you are for the twist ending, because the whole movie is really one way. The whole movie is one way, and then the ending is like, it's like, it's so much. It's a lot to handle, and when I tell you that the rest of the movie, the buildup is worth that ending like 5 minutes or whatever, I mean that. Also, of course, if you're in the mood for a foresty movie, this takes place basically completely in the forest. It's kind of ambiguous what time period this movie takes place. It feels extremely timeless to me, like it could be set in the 90s, it could be present day. I think this is a movie that will be rewatchable for me until the end of time. I promise you, even if you don't really end up liking the movie for whatever reason, I think that it's worth watching for the twist. I guarantee that you will not see where this movie is going to end up, and I just cannot really commend director Sean Linden enough. I'm really excited to see what he does in the future. And also Camille Sullivan, I am going to be keeping an eye out for her. I could go on and on about that movie. Maybe that should be the first one that I do as part of my streaming movie club. I announced on my community tab the other day that I did make a Twitch account. I'm going to start streaming over there rather than on YouTube. And one of my subscribers recommended that I start a movie club where I announce what movie I'm going to be talking about like a week prior, maybe on my community tab, and then I'll do a live stream where we all talk about that movie. So I think Hunter x Hunter would be just an amazing one. If it means that more people will watch that movie, then of course I would do that one. Anyway, sorry, getting off track, moving on now to my top 2 forest horror movies of all time. Now these two are slightly interchangeable just depending on what I'm in the mood for, so keep that in mind, because honestly on different days both of these movies take the number 1 spot. They are both just immaculate, incredible films. But for this list and just in general, I think this is the more solid standing for this movie. Coming in at number 2 is What Keeps You Alive. As I mentioned, another criminally underrated movie. Majestic mountains, a still lake, and venomous betrayals engulf a married couple attempting to celebrate their 1-year anniversary. Please, I am begging you not to watch trailers. That synopsis is really all I'm gonna give you in terms of the plot, because go into this movie as blind as possible. There are twists in literally every single act of the movie. The first act twist will knock you on your ass. Again, this one qualifies for a cabin in the woods type list, but majority of it does take place out in the woods, out on this lake. Beautiful, majestic setting, as mentioned in the synopsis. Definitely lends itself to the very isolating feel of this movie. It's fantastic. I personally gave this movie 4.5 stars on Letterboxd because it just rocked my world. Where I do think the movie falters a little bit is just in the third act, because you think that the movie ends several different times. It kind of felt like they shot like 5 different endings and then just put all of them into the movie. I don't think that it's necessarily a fault, because it's just kind of like twist after twist, and you know, things keep happening and it's very shocking. So it's not necessarily a fault, but the story starts to unravel just a little bit in the third act. Still phenomenal. Still, the ending is just, it's amazing. All the twists this story takes on, like what I would give to watch this movie for the first first time again, I couldn't even tell you. You also get some LGBTQ representation, so that's awesome. You don't typically see that in horror, especially not in the lead characters, which just you love to see it. But like I said, I literally do not want to spoil a single thing about this movie. Please, please go into it blind. I know a lot of people like to watch trailers to see if they're really interested in the movie. Please just take my word for it. You trust me, right? I could keep going on, but I'll just get repetitive, but I really can't praise the movie highly enough. I think that it's genius. And also genuinely pretty terrifying. I was definitely scared watching this movie because it's not even the gore and the overt horror elements, but the way that this movie messes with you psychologically, it's a lot. Okay, no, I have to stop myself. I'm gonna stop myself. I'm gonna move on to my number one forest horror movie of all time. I'm sorry if this was a little bit predictable because of what I mentioned earlier, but my number one forest horror movie of all time is The Blair Witch Project. Like I said, these first two are interchangeable. It's just depending on my mood, like do I want to watch found footage or not? So that's really the only thing kind of separating these and why they flip-flop sometimes. Also, hopefully I don't need to read the synopsis of The Blair Witch Project because hopefully we all know what it is by now. I also know that a lot of people don't find this movie to be scary, and that's like fair. It just depends on what works for you. And like I said, if this first movie didn't work for you, then maybe try Blair Witch because it does do things a little bit more overtly. There's a little bit more body horror. The jump scares are a little bit bigger. I do prefer things to be a bit more understated though, which is why this is just one of my favorite movies of all time. It's probably in my top 10 list of favorite horror movies of all time, I would say. It's certainly in my top 10 list of favorite found footage movies. But for this list, we're not really talking about like the style of the movie or the subgenre really. We're just talking about the setting, and this movie takes place fully in the forest. I think the beginning, they're kind of in the town a little bit because they're doing some research, but then for the whole rest of the movie, they are really just in the forest. They're also camping. It definitely has a summertime feel, even if, you know, they're wearing warmer clothing and stuff, because in the summertime when you're camping, it does get cold out there, and so it still very much feels like a summertime movie. Everything about the Blair Witch Project does give me kind of summertime, fall time vibes, and I think that it is one of the most pure forest horror movies of all time. So while with some of these other movies on the list that maybe I find to be better movies, I was really ranking these more just based on, you know, how much I like them as a forest movie. I've said forest so many times. If you were taking a shot every time I said forest, RIP. But I feel like I have talked about this movie enough on my channel at this point where I don't need to really get into all the nitty-gritty details about why I love it so much. It's also a very popular horror movie, definitely has its place in horror history, one of the most famous found footage movies of all time. So if you know, you know. So I think that it does partially speak for itself, you know. I think it definitely earned its place at number one. And I also know it's really subjective because a lot of people don't find that movie to be scary, and that's totally fine. This was just my list, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Wait, hold up. Oh my gosh. I literally just remembered there's one more movie I meant to put on this list that honestly probably makes my top 3. I can't believe I forgot to... Okay, anyways, moving past the fact that I forgot to put one of the best forest horror movies of all time on this list, let's just talk about it. It's called In the Earth, and it actually just came out super recently, I think like last month. So that's probably why I forgot to put it on the list, but nonetheless, here's the synopsis. As the world searches for a cure to a disastrous virus, a scientist and park scout venture deep into the forest for a routine equipment run. Through the night, their journey becomes a terrifying voyage through the heart of darkness, the forest coming to life around them. Now that I'm thinking about it, this honestly might be my favorite forest horror movie of all time, specifically because it just really revolves around the forest and the forest coming to life around them. But it comes to life in such an unexpected way because, in my opinion, the whole thing is just an allegory for tripping on magic mushrooms. But there's also a lot of body horror if that's what you're into. All the visuals are super, super trippy. A lot of sequences of the movie feel extremely experimental because they're just basically psychedelic visuals. The movie is absolutely not going to be for everybody, but this is just my list and it definitely belongs in the top 3 at least. Maybe that's also why I forgot to include it on the list, because it's honestly just really not going to be for everybody. I would say that maybe like 1 in 15 people will actually truly enjoy and love this film. So that being said, I think everyone should still give it a chance. I think you should definitely give it a shot. If you want a true forest horror movie, then this is absolutely the one. It's gonna be something that you're looking for. I'm so glad that I remembered right away that I forgot that movie, and so I could just like hop back down and talk about it. But I did talk about it in my April wrap-up video, so go see that if you want to hear more about the movie. Now for your regularly scheduled outro. Apologies. rock and roll. Anyone else's allergies just been acting up lately? Oh my gosh. Anyway, so that concludes the topic of this video. Again, like I mentioned, definitely subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you know whenever I post. Keep an eye out on my community tab for our first movie club meeting, because hopefully that's coming within like the next week. You can find me on Twitch and my horror Instagram actually at Haunted Hippie Horror. I also have a personal Instagram page, I have a Twitter, I have a TikTok, I have a Letterboxd, so you can find that all linked down below. I hope that you enjoyed this video and I hope I catch you in the next one. Bye!